أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome to this, the 8th episode of Ramadan Real Talk, this year's Ramadan Real Talk series, the second year in a row that we've been bringing this, and the curtain comes to a close on this series tonight. It's been a fascinating series of episodes once again. Jazakumullahu khairan for joining us again tonight on what is an auspicious night in the last 10 nights of Ramadan. So we're very, very grateful to have you here and looking forward to a fantastic conversation to close out what has been a series of fantastic conversations. Now, for those of you joining us for the first time, just a very, very quick high-level summary on what we're doing here today. So Ramadan Real Talk has been a series of conversations exploring important issues to do with the well-being, the whole overall well-being of our community, and some of the issues that aren't given enough light of day. We're discussing tonight a fascinating topic and a very important topic, namely finding hope in the context of trauma. So understanding trauma, healing, and growth. So it's going to be a really, really rich conversation, inshallah. I'm looking forward to introducing you to two of our guests. But before we do that, just want to start us off by having a quick look at a video relating to the organization that is hosting this series, National Zakat Foundation. To those of you who may not be as familiar with its work, NZF Australia is the Australian branch of a global NGO that seeks to channel the blessings of zakah back into the local Western communities in which it operates. It now operates in 5 different Western countries where Muslims live, Australia being one of them, and has been operating here since 2013 and has channeled some $11-12 million back into the local community and making sure that people who are eligible for zakah here receive it, and inshallah that their lives are transformed through it. So we'll have a look at a video which really captures the essence of NZF Australia's work. And of course, for those of you who on the cusp of the 27th night, where I think 80% of the ummah gives its zakah, are considering a destination for your zakah, then this is a fantastic option to look at in terms of helping our community become self-sustaining and be able to look after our own people who often slip through the safety net of the welfare system. So I'll ask the team to roll this video for us, and it's a great look at the work that NZF does. Bilal?
Zakat today, change tomorrow.
That is where our communities are to start doing.
To start the journey to self-sufficient community where no one in need is left abandoned.
Since Ramadan last year, we've hit $12 million in zakat distributed since our foundation in 2013.
We entered a bold phase with a new brand of fresh approach, launching programs in specific areas where we partnered with service providers who are great at what they do.
We channeled your zakat to them, collaborating with others through the power of zakat to help elevate poverty and create generational change in our community.
We've established new partnerships with incredible organizations and leaders in our community, such as MCCA, Al-Firdaus College, and specialist consultants in the health space, counseling, psychology services, and coaching.
And the results have been remarkable, alhamdulillah.
From helping domestic violence survivors through zakat to giving orphan Muslim children the financial support and care they need to have a future.
Also for giving homeless Muslims a dignified future and self-sufficiency.
From helping Muslims bury their dead during the pandemic's worst moments when they had no money to do so, to giving new Muslims the crucial support lifeline they need as they transition to life as a Muslim.
All this and more has happened just since last Ramadan, where we've served close to 3,000 cases over the last 12 months alone.
We've also gone a step further to assist our community through quality goods by launching an additional 2 Ziggy's thrift stores in Melbourne and in Campbelltown, New South Wales, alongside our original thrift store in Liverpool, New South Wales.
But this is just the start.
The possibilities are incredible.
The chance to chart our community's independent future
is remarkable.
And this is what we're calling you to support this Ramadan. We aim to expand our services further in the next 12 months, to increase the cases we serve, to unlock the power of zakat even further, and partner with more specialist organizations.
To help even more Muslims live a life of dignity, supported by their community and never left alone. To help your zakah change tomorrow.
Jazakallah khair. Subhanallah, very deep insight into the work that NZF is doing. So again, keep NZF in mind for tomorrow night if you haven't made up your mind in that regard, inshallah. So without further ado, let's get into today's awesome topic. And I just want to introduce our viewers to our esteemed guests here. I've got with me 2 fantastic members of our community who've been involved deeply in the community and its well-being for some time now. To my left is brother Mohamed Tabbaa. Brother Mohamed is a criminologist by background and also a writer, a prolific writer and a wonderful writer at that. Penned some awesome thoughts that really, really make you think. Mohamed has been extensively involved in the community going back some 15 years, and I've had the great pleasure of doing some things with him and having made his acquaintance some time ago. He's been involved practically, he's been involved in mentoring, he's been involved in thinking through our condition and where we're going, and he's especially interested in notions of selfhood, which he's sort of delved deeply into in the course of his academic studies. So we look forward to diving into Mohamed's experience in this space and also some of the reflections in light of some of the studies that he's done. So Mohamed, welcome to the episode. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having
me. And we've got Sr Nasreen Hanifi, who needs a little introduction to Real Talk viewers. I think it's the third time Sr Nasreen has been with us, and there's been some awesome episodes that I've had the pleasure of hosting with her on. Sr Nasreen is a clinical psychologist by background and a budding academic as well. She's doing her PhD at the moment on compassion, which is a fascinating topic which we'll hopefully explore a little bit. So she runs her own psychology practice, mashallah. So she's an entrepreneur as well. She gets that title here tonight with an awesome team at My Ability Care. And is doing really, really good work in the community when it comes to trauma and being really at the coalface of, the practical experiences people have. So, Sr Nasreen, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to you as well.
Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. So, let's get into it. Let me start off, inshallah, by asking both of you, brother and sister. I'll start with you, Brother Mohamed. What interested you in today's discussion? When I said, Mohamed, what do you reckon? Let's do this. And I know we started talking about a different conversation altogether, but then we sort of, when we were discussing what the community needs, you mentioned this. Why trauma, and what interests you about it?
Look, it's an interesting question. I mean, if we can, I guess, go back to the original topic which you proposed was racism, and it's obviously a pertinent discussion and one that I've been involved in for quite some years. The reason I was drawn more to this discussion is that I find that trauma underpins a lot of the issues, not only around racism, but more generally around the way that we live. For me, there's a personal element to it. So I've had quite a broad experience with traumatic experiences, as well as many different modes of therapy. So for me, tying that personal experience back into understandings of racism, understandings of Islam, secularity, how we live in this world, for me, that's something that's heavily under-discussed and underappreciated. So hence, I found that it would be a bit more useful, in my opinion, to discuss the foundations of, because for me, racism is essentially a traumatic response to an experience of the world. So for me, I'd like to dig further at the foundations, how we got here, how we get out, rather than the more surface level discussions of, the discussions that we tend to have.
And Sr Nasreen, what about you? What was your reaction and what interests you about this?
I'm very interested in trauma, and I've worked in this sector for a very long time. So any opportunity to actually talk about it and educate and raise awareness for the community is something I think I always think is beneficial. So that's you, and I think people who have experience, whether it's professional or personal experience, to be able to share that to the wider community, I think that's always helpful as well. That somehow creates awareness and an understanding of what trauma is. So that's why I'm interested.
Awesome, excellent. So let's begin for the purposes of the episode and for the benefit of our audience, defining trauma, right? And there's a broad context that I want to couch this in, which is, and I guess many of our topics when we have started off discussing in the Real Talk series, where there's a nuanced and deep and academic and professional side of discussion, and then there's the very pop sort of wider, broader sort of culture sort of connotation that phrases take, which often takes away from the seriousness of those issues. And I feel like trauma is one of them, unfortunately, where it has become so popularized, and pop psychology has made it such a thing that every second thing that moves is traumatized in some way, shape, or form. Not to take away from the experiences people have, but really has become something that gets thrown around by lay people, very, very casually, I suppose. And so it helps to define what trauma is, and I'd also like you guys to shed some light on what it isn't with reference to this sort of context. So I might start with you, Sis. How should we conceive of trauma? What is trauma?
Trauma is an emotional reaction to a catastrophic event. That catastrophic event could be singular, it could be just a one-off incident, or it could be a multiple and repeated incident. You don't necessarily have to be involved in the experience to have trauma. It could be vicariously, whether watching, say, for example, people who from my country, from Afghanistan, for example, when the Taliban took over, a lot of them were living back, in the early 2000s or late 1990s when that was happening, relived all of that through social media. And a lot of them who were, whose parents had lived through that, were born here, also lived through that moment. So it's not necessarily like you have to live in, you have to experience it yourself. You can actually experience it vicariously and still be traumatized by an event. So it is usually a person's emotional response to something quite difficult.
Ahmed, anything you'd add to that?
My experience obviously doesn't come from a clinical background. So in terms of my research on selfhood, understanding ourselves, trauma would be, I guess, a bit more broadly defined as a violence to the self. So a violation of the relationship to self. So a severing of that, of the way that we understand and relate to ourselves. And in that sense, it's a splitting of that connection that we have to selfhood. So it's very similar in a way, probably just a bit more broadly defined.
Yeah. So what is trauma not?
It's really difficult to sort of pin that down, because people, to me, I always think of it like, when we look at narcissism, for example, every person...
Exactly the parallel that comes to mind,
and it comes to mind when I think of it. It's the same thing. So it's not like, well, my mum and dad were a little bit harsh on me, for example, and now I'm traumatized. It really, so those kind of... I don't know what's a better way of saying it, simple things that happen in your life, that really isn't trauma. It needs to be something so severe that the person actually has great difficulty in day-to-day functioning, or it affects their relationships or their emotion regulation. So I don't know if there's any other way to explain that, but it isn't things that you would experience on a mild level. It's not bad
feelings, it's not sadness, it's not anxiousness, it's not the general condition of living which goes through all of these different states. It is something that traumatizes the self, and if it doesn't traumatize the self, it's not trauma.
Well, like my husband, for example, I don't know, was talking to me inappropriately. I've had women who've said that to me. She's like, I'm so traumatized by that.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm getting at. Well, not women specifically, just to be clear. But those sorts of reactions to things that happen in the exigencies of everyday life, right?
It's part and parcel of, for example, a marital relationship anyway. But women will say oftentimes in therapy, or men, that, or she was so inappropriate to me, or she was very rude. So I'm so traumatized by that. And when we use the word so loosely, we actually take away the actual meaning out of it. So for me, it is that I wouldn't define trauma as that.
I think any term, once it becomes popularized, it loses depth and meaning, and that's just part and parcel of it becoming mainstream. We saw that with so many things, Islamophobia, racism, all these different concepts. And I was involved in some of the massive push to make it mainstream. And then once it went mainstream, we're like, what happened? This is not what we intended.
That's right.
So I guess that's always a bit of a double-edged sword. But one thing, going back to the examples you were mentioning, one thing that strikes me when we have these discussions, there is, sort of memification of the idea of trauma, which is problematic. It takes away from the meaning and the experience. But I think also there's something to be said of, if people are describing these things as traumatic and they're really mundane and simple, and they don't fit any clinical definition, it could still be that the person is traumatized. And it's not that thing that particularly traumatized them. That thing could be a trigger to a deeper trauma. So, for example, if somebody has experienced quite severe trauma, and being yelled at might trigger them, and they describe that as traumatizing, it's triggering, they're using the wrong language. It could still be the case that they have previously been traumatized, they simply don't recognize it, and so they project that onto the experience at hand. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that.
Look, I think in order for people to be triggered by something like that, they need to have had some kind of an experience. And it needs to, it would have been something quite drastic, that sort of changed their perception of themselves, the world around them, the people around them and whatnot. So that is usually why, after a while, if they've sort of bottled it up and never really coped with it or dealt with it, chances are that a comment that a husband or a mother-in-law or a friend or anybody makes will usually trigger them, or even like a look
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't necessarily
Anything,
have to,
really.
anything will start to trigger them,
Yeah.
because those underlying issues that they've experienced that they never sort of solved,
Yeah, they're still there.
still there.
Yeah, and a trigger is an association to a thing. It doesn't have to be a replica.
Yeah.
So, for example, if somebody has witnessed domestic violence and they were, traumatized by certain experiences, they don't need to re-experience domestic violence necessarily to be triggered. There could be an association with an object that was in the room at the time. It could be with a particular word, a language, like you said, a look. It could be anything. So I think, on the one hand, there is the oversimplification of trauma in popular discourse. But I think part of it, not all of it, part of it also refers back to what you're saying. There is widespread trauma that is often unacknowledged and unresolved. And that might be just the cover for that we're seeing.
Got it. So it's like, you've got to be, I think when addressing these, there's got to be a level of sensitivity not to push back too strongly against that memification, because there may be genuine cases where at the surface of it seems benign, but really there's deep, real trauma, and it's just being triggered by something that seems, quite run of the mill. Yeah. And we've actually got a comment from a sister Zainab. Jazakumullah khair, sis, for your comment. She said, trauma triggers an emotional response of the traumatic event. Ongoing chronic emotional neglect can activate someone's abandonment from the past. So not necessarily the case that in the moment it was that bad. To everyone else it might seem very run of the mill, but for that person, what it brings back of old wounds may be quite significant. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, and I guess that sort of gets at the second question I had, or issue I wanted to address: has the popularization of trauma hurt its proper understanding? So Mohamed, I might start with you. Given what you've seen of experiences elsewhere, especially the comment you made earlier was very interesting, because we've occupied similar community spaces in the past, and I've seen that sort of the wave that has been ridden by the community on various other counts. On this and on mental health type issues, do you think net it's better to have these phrases thrown around a lot more casually and for people to start getting familiar with them, or do you think it actually takes away from genuinely addressing people and their traumas?
Look, I mean, I'm not speaking as a clinician, so I can't talk about how the industry has dealt with it. But in terms of the popular understanding and where it's gone, I don't think it helps very much to talk about it in terms of better or worse. It's sort of we're in this part of the cycle of the community's engagement with trauma. If we look back to our parents' generation, even my generation, it was completely absent. I didn't grow up with I'd never heard the word trauma or healing or anything of the sort. I didn't know that therapy existed, or that there was such a thing as psychology, probably until I reached uni. So in that sense, it's been immensely beneficial. It's become a common word, and it can facilitate people's willingness to seek out therapy and seek out healing. So in that sense, there's an obvious benefit. Like I said, we've experienced this obviously with other topics that once they become mainstream, they do lose a certain depth. I think that's part and parcel of the transmission of knowledge, to be honest. So I'm not too fussed about it being better or worse or a bad thing. It just is. The knowledge starts in a particular place, it gets developed, and then certain aspects of that trickle through to the mainstream, and it reaches people at their capacity. So I think so long as we're balancing the simplification of trauma with some real knowledge, some real practices that are really embodying the concept rather than abstracting and memifying it, then I think overall I think it's better that the mainstream are familiar even with a shallow concept than completely ignorant.
And we'll get to the types. Which
Can I just add to that? I think I also agree, because I don't think there's a worse, a bad, or a good way of looking at it. But I think the fact that even though the word is being popularized and people are talking, at least we're talking about it as a community, right?
Exactly,
because I don't think over the last 10, 12, 15 years, we've come a little bit further than where we were, exactly. where we are actually talking about topics that we think were too taboo to talk about back then, or stigmatized. So I think that's been quite helpful.
It's a big positive, yeah.
It's a big positive.
Even something like this event could not have happened 10 years ago. It's just absolutely impossible in our community. So I mean, for me, this is evidence that. Alhamdulillah.
So let's look at yourself, Brother Mohammed, for a second before I talk about the types of trauma, and that's sort of adding some of the detail that we want to and some of the nuance that we want to. So you mentioned that you come at this from an experiential sort of perspective. Tell us about that a little bit. What does that mean? What's your personal experience with trauma, and I guess what's your journey to the extent that you're willing to engage us in that?
So I'm quite willing to be open about my trauma, because I think it can provide a good inshallah learning. So my experience with trauma is over 30 years long. So I experienced trauma as a young child, which was only diagnosed a few years back. And so throughout that period, I was hospitalized many times. I went through the medical system endlessly. So, all sorts of tests. I had major stomach pains. I had chest pains. I had pains all over my body, and things that just didn't make sense. I was a very healthy young kid. I was very active, played a lot of sports. Where every time I'd get my bloods done, they were excellent. So everything was good on paper. And subhanAllah, every time I would get a medical examination done of any sort, tubes and all these sorts of things, they would come back excellent, not just fine, but excellent. And so it created this growing rift within me of something is very seriously wrong. Severe digestive problems, excreting blood, all sorts of really painful experiences. And the doctors kept telling me that everything's amazing. And subhanAllah, it was only when I was actually writing my honours thesis. I was at uni on a Saturday, and I was writing away, I was running behind, deadline, all that sort of thing. And then the next day I woke up and I collapsed. And I'm talking physically collapsed. I was rushed to hospital, and by the time I got to hospital, I was wheeled in on a wheelchair. I completely lost all faculties, so I could not control my body whatsoever. I was paralyzed for a little while, and I was just screaming at the top of my lungs uncontrollably for 6 hours straight, pacing up and down the hospital, streaming tears, and I had no idea what was going on. It wasn't linked to anything specific. Nothing had happened. I'd literally just woken up, gotten out of bed. And so that for me was the beginning of a more conscious healing journey where I'm like, right, something is very wrong. I was the type who, understood myself and was understood by many others as having it under control. I was doing very well at work, very well at uni, I was, accomplished, all those sorts of measures that we have for health, tick, tick, tick. And as subhanAllah, I have this incident, and it really changed my focus on life and on health. So from there, pretty much I started investigating a lot more seriously into I didn't know the word trauma even by that stage, realistically, but I started investigating more into self and self-care. And it was, interestingly enough, subhanAllah, it was actually one of my academic studies that really opened it up for me, which was Foucault, who cops a lot of belting in the popular discourse, but that's what worked for me. So he explores the notion of self-care or care of the soul in ancient Greece. He touches a little bit on Islamic notions of it, but he mainly focuses on ancient Greece and how care of the soul was philosophy. That's how philosophy was practiced. So it wasn't an abstract thing. It wasn't thinking about things. It was living a particular way that was healthy for the soul primarily, and that filtered down to every other part of our lives. And he mentioned, as I said, a snippet about Islamic traditions, and that sort of opened me up to explore that. And pretty much since then, I've just been on a journey going through so many different modalities of therapy. I've tried so many at this point. I have my own practice that I do on my own, and it's pretty much it's really redirected my research as well. So my research has gone into notions of selfhood, understanding not health but healing. What trauma does to a person in terms of violence and violating the self. What our tradition says about healing, and we talked earlier about shifa, shifa uma fi sudur, the Quran as a healing tool. All these sorts of things opened up for me, and pretty much, so your opening question of why the interest in this topic, it really changed my life. And it wasn't a choice that I had. If you had asked me 15 years ago, I would have scoffed at the notion of trauma and healing, like other people do in our community, as this is nonsense, this is hippie stuff and whatnot. But it really hit me, and I had no choice but to deal with it. And since then, it's been absolutely fascinating, and I've seen it as underpinning so many of society's ills and so many of our own ills that we struggle to acknowledge, and sometimes we abstract them and really make them into something a lot more complicated than they are, when a lot of the times in my own experience they come from a place of hurt. So that really is in a nutshell. I'm happy to expand on more, but
and on that, because, and again, not being nosy, right? Because that's not the idea here. So what was it in your childhood? And without necessarily asking what exactly it was, but was it incidents? Was it things that happened which left a scar? Like, what genus of things are we talking about here?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because I come from a family of 7 siblings, and we all had, we were raised together, and we've all come out very different, in terms of our relation to our childhood. So this will draw back to the earlier conversation we're having about types of trauma, which Nasreen will go into in a minute. But mine was an ongoing experience of very, very minor incidences, which is why I was careful to draw on the earlier example of, not dismissing. So some of them, there are a multitude of experiences that I went through as a young child, from 6 years old onwards, is the earliest that I've traced. Very, very minor, very minor, and non-eventful. And if I were to raise them, people would just, it's very easy to dismiss, and I myself dismissed them until I witnessed in the therapy the effect that they have. And I've been now in active therapy for 10 years, and we've just been unlayering the injured self, just peeling it back, and getting to the base of it. And at the base of it, which I discovered in a very intense therapy session a few years back, was a single word. Which is really profound, and it brought to mind so many hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. The word you might see as simple, weighs heavily 7 years down in Jahannam. Yeah. All of these things come back and give a really new meaning to the deen and to language and to how we relate with each other. So for me, it wasn't a single incident. It was so I have complex PTSD, which Nasreen will, I'm sure, go into in a minute, is not a singular event. There wasn't a car crash, there wasn't any one big thing. It was just a series of incidences. It impacted my sense of self from that age, and it pretty much remained, so part of me remained stunted as a 6-year-old up until I began that healing more seriously and was able to develop that child within me. So there isn't any one thing I can point to specifically to say this is what happened. There's just a series of things that were very, and I don't want to be unfair here, I had a very typical upbringing. It wasn't drastically different to anybody that I knew. So we migrated from Lebanon. I was born in Lebanon, so I experienced the migration at a young age. We moved from house to house growing up. We weren't particularly well off. Those sorts of really basic things. But I lived with my family. My parents were together. Everything was normal in that sense, which is really probably the main message that I would emphasize. You don't have to have gone through something drastic or or phenomenal. The mundane can also traumatize. It just can.
Let me prod with a very, very harsh response to that, right? And I'm saying this not because I have any doubt in the seriousness of what you're saying, but because I know that out there in our community there is this perspective, right? So some people will say, "Oh, you're just privileged. You had it all so good. You're just whinging. You don't know what real hardship looks like." Right? The real hardship is in your country right now, Lebanon, what's happening economically, or next door in Syria or Palestine or whatever. And some people say this is just a discussion of first world people, who maybe didn't have the ideal upbringing, and they're just sort of mellowing in their first world condition. Although what you said relates to me greatly. Like, I think you're sort of almost telling my story in many ways. Like, these little things that happen, which they're in your mind. Like, there are certain incidents that I play back all the time. And I had a very good upbringing at the face of it as well. How do we respond to that?
So a couple of points I would make. Firstly, in my particular situation, I am from Lebanon. So I'm born there. So if people want to criticize that, that's where the trauma is. I'm from there. And if that's where the trauma is, then I was born in that traumatic situation. And, my parents migrated because of the war. My brother was born in Syria because my parents were fleeing. So I experienced that, and even as a baby, you can experience trauma, it can stay with you. So on a very simplistic front, that's easy to dismiss in that sense. The I guess deeper point would be that trauma is relative. It's relative to our constitution, it's relative to our experience, it's relative to our circumstances. And so it doesn't matter if somebody's had it tougher. Trauma is specific to me in my circumstances, and like I said, it can be a single word. It can be, and the Prophet told off one of his wives for a simple glance, and again, when I went through my healing experience, and you very vividly understand where the trauma came from, where specific traumas came from, specific incidents, and what they led to within you. The link is very clear in the therapy. Then those sorts of the admonishments from the Prophet ﷺ make a lot of sense. It wasn't simplistic. It wasn't him being overzealous. It was him, recognizing that, hold on, anything can cause trauma relative to the situation. So I would respond by saying trauma is always relative. And yes, correct. Yeah, correct. So on the one hand, yes, we've talked about how it's oversimplified and I guess abused in some ways, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it is entirely relative, and even privileged people do get traumatized just because you have, and this for me is the biggest Islamic point. We're not materialists. The fact that somebody is well off in the dunya doesn't mean they're not going to be suffering. And so trauma in that context of suffering and experiencing the ills of that violation to self is universal, can be universal.
Let me tie this into a really important question, and this is the selfhood stuff, right? And the subjectivity of this sort of stuff. So what capacity, and this is another Islamic notion, where Allah does not burden souls more than they can bear, right? And so what Allah has given capacity for a particular individual might be very different to some other individual. So can you talk to us a little bit about that in terms of what you've seen in both your academic work and how you reflect on that experientially, where it could just be that two people are constituted very differently, and what maybe a non-event for someone is deeply hurtful to another person.
Yeah, look, it's a very important notion that I work with quite a lot in my work. And I want to do something a little bit controversial here and reorient it entirely, because when we talk about capacity, we often talk about it in a negative sense. You don't have the capacity to withstand this experience. Like this person, my siblings, for example, some of them didn't experience the trauma that I did. And we talk about that often as a weakness, which I see is very problematic, because in my opinion, it goes entirely against the grain of the Islamic understanding of growth and what these sufferings do. So, there's the famous hadith, إِذَا حَبَ اللَّهُ الْعَبْدَ ابْتَلَاهُ. If Allah loves a servant, He throws them into calamity. Yeah. Now, the what we call the lack of capacity is in many ways a cultivation process for selfhood, for an expanded selfhood. And there's the famous episode when Rumi met Shams in the streets, and Shams, who became his spiritual master, challenged him. And he said, who was closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the, awliya or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because of the different statements they made. And his response for me really reflects this dynamic, where he said, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was greater, for even though he said, I haven't fulfilled my obligations or relation towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's because his capacity was much greater. Yeah, his capacity to withstand the suffering and to grow from it was much greater than other people. And the Prophet ﷺ was, of course, put through many calamities throughout his life. We don't look at him as a model of weakness. He's a model of strength. He's a model of compassion. He is our model for how we connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how we practice our deen. And he didn't have an easy life, without suffering. He was put through all of these calamities over and over, and they are in many ways a cleansing process. They're a process of growth and transformation, and they are a process of cultivating that resilience, because resilience isn't an abstract concept. It's not something that we think or believe exclusively. It forms us in particular ways, so that by the time we've gone through these processes of cultivation or purification, the tazkiyah, these things no longer affect us. And that, for example, with the experience of many prophets, not just Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it sets them up for a particular purpose. And I believe in the same way, expands them, but also produces them in a particular way. Like Musa alayhi salam, was put through, the conditions and the experiences that he was put through to prepare him to meet Fir'aun. If he had gone there without any experience of suffering, he might not have been capable of facing a massive tyrant. So for me, they are actually very positive experiences if and only if and when you reach the point of healing and you turn that experience around, you're able to experience it as an immense blessing. Not something, this is what I was referring to at the beginning, it's not something that, oh God, I went through this, it was terrible, but alhamdulillah, it's behind me now. It actually is a big blessing in many ways, because it creates that resilience and that capacity to encompass a lot more compassion, encompass a lot more mercy, and encompass a greater relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's how I...
But I'm going to touch on that a little bit, because I think it's really important for people to have a lot of self-insight to be able to do that, and with the right kind of supports and coping mechanisms, because oftentimes, when they are faced with that sort of a calamity, it's like, why me? Yeah. Why did this happen to me? So it's really difficult for them to then be in a position to say, oh, well, this is a blessing. Yeah. Maybe Allah is preparing me for something far greater, and I'm going to just ride with the journey. I always find that the flip side, that they usually go, Allah's punishing me for something. What have I done? Am I a really terrible person? Yeah. So there's always those negative core beliefs that sort of come onto the surface anyway with that. So it really requires people to have the ability to self-reflect and have insight into whatever experience that they're going through, and look at it from a different angle, and with the right supports, they can have the right set of coping mechanisms to be able to ride with the storm.
Yeah. How would you reflect on everything Mohamed's just said? There's a lot. There's
a lot to unpack, but I think I'm gonna touch base on his first experience. I'm actually going to say thank you, because sometimes it's really courageous to talk about your own personal experience on a platform where so many people are watching, and oftentimes, that's never acknowledged. So thank you for sharing that with us. But I just want to touch base on the first point you said. When you were telling us about your experience, and that you really didn't have any idea, or you couldn't pinpoint why you were feeling like this. But with us, from a clinical perspective, trauma lives when you experience something. Doesn't matter how big or small it is obviously based on your experience, your perception of those comments or of those situations, that the body responds first and foremost before you psychologically respond. So even though you were like, I was fine, I was at university, I was doing well academically, I was doing well, I was flourishing in life, but your body wasn't. So your body was trying to sort of tell you, hey, I'm not coping. And that is usually the first point of response for anybody who's experienced trauma, is that their body will respond every time they hear a comment, every time they have a smell, or they've experienced, they see the person that's, for example, that's raped them, the resemblance of that. Their body is the first thing that will respond, because our bodies go through the process of fight, flight, or freeze. And so the physicality of it, usually the physiological responses are the first signs.
I want to touch on that, because to a lot of people that might be surprising.
Yes.
Right? They'll be like, okay, this is like an emotional thing, and you're having a real body response to that. Yeah. What does the current science tell us? And this is also, it's a funny space, because this is where all the interesting folk enter the discussion, the Reiki and the distance healing and all the stuff that goes on in the weird and wonderful world, which is, let's call it, alternative medicine, if you want to call it that. But as people, let's say evidence-based medicine and science, how do we understand that? And what is the latest evidence telling us about how the body responds to these sorts of things? So in your case, it wasn't you've got IBD, you've got, cancer, or you've got this, or you've got that. This is what's coming out of the test result. Everything is going well, right? So how do you then make the connection between my body is responding in a certain way, it could be trauma or some sort of mental illness or mental health issue that is triggering that? And how do you come to that sort of conclusion and then begin to address that? How will people make that connection in many cases?
I think it's really difficult, first of all, for a lot of people to make that connection if they don't sort of have the awareness or the education around this, or the right sort of coping mechanisms or support systems around them to identify that. But we usually say, well, I'll give you an example. So I was doing this interview over the weekend, and one of the ladies said to me that, my mum comes from Afghanistan, but when she's been seeing social media for the last 3 months, and she said all of a sudden she's got all these pains in her body that she really didn't have before. Her legs are hurting, her stomach is in pain. We've done the test, everything came back clear. We don't know what's going on. And I said, but you can clearly link it, but she can't link it, right? Because she doesn't have the right tools or the knowledge to be able to do that. And I said, but you can link it, can't you? I said, because look at what's unfolding in Afghanistan and what she would have experienced if she was living there 20 years ago. So that's reliving all of that, and her body is responding to it first, saying, listen, I'm not okay. Yeah. Another example is, if a young child who's been sexually abused, for example, at the age of 5, the natural response is that, if the perpetrator is there, the child is looking for somebody to come and save them. Their body is and if no one is coming, there's no safety net, the body learns to freeze itself. So as they're growing older, every time they experience, intimacy or they experience relationships, their bodies will freeze, because that's what they associate the experience with. And no one's coming to my safety, so no one will come and save me. So there is a lot of evidence right now, especially in research, that talks about the body's response to trauma, because we've sort of, previously we were talking about the psychological impacts, but now we've sort of moved on to the more physiological and biological aspect of it, which I think is so, there needs to be more awareness around this.
Because that's just fascinating. I mean, the way that your body responded is just, it's mind-blowing. But it's also, it's only a natural extension of how we all feel when we feel anxiety, right? And the heart starts racing. and the belly feels like, you know what, and in my case, it's just like my stomach just goes to complete crap. Like, you know, I need to, if it's severe enough and prolonged enough, then I'm off to the loo, and like, you know, all the rest of it won't describe. But really, if that can happen, then why can't something greater than that happen if there is such a history? And I think that is where, you know, the connection between mental health and physical health, which is starting to be recognized, is so important, because often, you know, what's affecting you there may not be some physical input in the way that we normally understand, like a broken hand or whatever. It could be something so fundamental to your constitutive being and how, you know, you experience yourself or understand yourself as a result of past experiences. SubhanAllah. So it's quite a profound sort of thing.
It is,
Yeah.
I might make a couple of comments on the whole body question, because that's been a very interesting one for me as well. So I think what Nasreen is has drawn on a few times about the self-reflection and self-awareness is crucial. So in my situation, for example, where I grew up, I didn't know anybody who's done therapy. That language just was non-existent in my world. And like I said, it wasn't until I sort of did my own discovery that I discovered all these spaces. So the self-awareness is a big part of it. And in that sense, there's a lot of self-discovery work that we can do, or I guess we can teach to recognize what's happening in the body. So even things like rage, you know, I think amongst men it's pretty commonly accepted that we just have rage, as if it's an inherent male trait. You know, it comes along with being a man, but that is in many instances a traumatic response, and it's not something that's healthy. It's something that needs to be dealt with and healed. But in terms of understanding the body and the connection, again, this for me, you know, having my own experiences with the body, and I only gave you a glimpse of them, really opened up my understanding of the deen. So, you know, we know, so the clinical research is, like you said, is currently in the midst of moving towards a greater understanding of the physiology or the somatic experience of suffering. But for example, the Quran talks about the body as a witness to the pain. You know, يَوْمَ تَشْهَدُ عَلَيْهِمْ أَلْسِنَتُهُمْ وَأَيْدِيهِمْ وَأَرْجُلُهُم. You know, the day that the body will testify, because the body is the site of our temporal experience in this world. And there's multiple examples of that where the body is used as the testimony. This was in our legal tradition as well, which is why the corporal punishments are a core part of it. So these sorts of things for me really helped me move through the healing, particularly because my first few experiences in going to therapy were not great. So I started with a few different types of cognitive behavioral therapy. I moved into psychoanalysis, and to be honest, they were really not helpful. The cognitive behavioral was focusing entirely, and it could have just been the practitioners that I saw, but most of them were focusing entirely on the mental. And alhamdulillah, I have a sharp mind. You know, I'm an academic. I got away with everything. You know, the questions that were posed, I answered very well. And they said to me, you know, you're in excellent shape. What are you doing here? One of them actually asked me, why are you here? The psychoanalytic as well, I believe, is based on very particular assumptions about, and again, it could have just been the particular people that I saw, but very particular assumptions about the body that I felt didn't align with my own constitution. And subhanAllah, was only, and I wanted to touch on the idea of alternative, you know, therapies, because that for me was a big part of it as well. And again, I used to scoff at them. I really did, quite a lot. But I experienced quite profound healing in some of those therapies, and I still do. So for me, the most profound therapies that I began to experience were ones that were, you know, not entirely evidence-based. And by that I mean, you know, I saw an occupational therapist in Melbourne, which was the first real deep dive that I had with a therapist. And she was drawing on a lot of historical traditions from the East. Now, these are not really evidence-based in the way that we accept today. So she taught me some things about the Islamic tradition of healing. She would bring in all these different philosophies, world philosophies, you know, ancient history type therapies, and they were very effective for me. Now, it doesn't mean they're universal, doesn't mean they're amazing, but they worked for me. In other instances, I experimented with like the hippie crowd, for example, you know, all right, what do you guys do? And they showed me, and I experienced profound healing with them. So I don't want to discount. I mean, I think there needs to be a fine balance, because, and the reason I say this is, probably even today, I was looking up a therapist, an Irish therapist, who has tried to bring in the notion of the soul quite seriously into therapy, and she's been discredited as a result. So
Right.
there is in one instance, obviously we know that,
An overlap with the Islamic tradition there.
well, not only that, but in terms of the traditions that we have currently, the Western traditions, they're secular, and you can be punished for bringing in notions of spirituality or the soul. And so there is a ceiling to the what we call the evidence-based approach.
Gotcha. No,
The
fair
evidence
enough.
is a particular corpus.
Yeah.
The Quran is not considered
Physical
evidence, for
materialist
example.
sort of
Correct. Yeah.
understanding. Sure.
So I think, and I mean, I might draw on you here. I see broadly that there's a shift in that direction. I don't think we're anywhere near there yet clinically, but there is a move in that direction. And so the most effective healing that I've experienced, as I've said, has drawn on multiple traditions, the current clinical evidence-based, but also the ones that, some of them are discredited, some of them are just not visible. The psych I currently see is brilliant, and he draws on a lot of the Islamic tradition, which is not in the literature. It's his own understanding. He sort of gelled it with, contemporary understanding. So there isn't, I don't think it's as clear-cut as evidence or not evidence in the current climate.
That's a very fair point.
I think in a clinical setting, we're trained to sort of focus on things that are very methodical, and Western, unfortunately, types of therapeutic interventions are very much like that. So it really makes it difficult for us to create interventions that have spirituality focus on it. But in saying that, it really depends on the therapist and the way they engage with their client, and it's up to the client. If that is something that they really want to explore, and it's part of their makeup, then that is the therapist. If they're experienced enough in that area as well, they can explore that. It really comes down to that as well. Some therapists or clinicians are not really experienced in spirituality. So how do you connect that with the client that's seeking that as well? But I think there is a shift, and a lot of psychologists that I know are also sort of working in bringing that into the new modalities of treatment, which I think is great, because I've seen it myself. I've done drug and alcohol treatment before, and I think the most successful ones have been the ones who've done spirituality.
Holistic,
it's holistic.
No, that's an excellent point, Brother Hamid. I guess perhaps maybe evidence-based was the wrong word to use, but more like, because even in some of these alternative pathways, there can be some philosophical commitments that perhaps might conflict with some issues to do with our deen, I think, at times. And so I think it's more, from my perspective, a byword for that. And again, because of my own experiences with my kids and their condition, I've also gone down this rabbit hole of multiple modalities, and in my case, it's autism. And so that's a whole new world where every man and his son has got a cure or something or other, from homeopathy to some of this energy healing stuff. And so I guess that there are some that make philosophical commitments which Islam would probably forbid. And I think when I say evidence-based, what I really mean is like stuff which doesn't have any sort of indication as to how it may work underlying it. It's not necessarily a thing which brings in spirituality. So I think it's a very good point that you've made, which is that it would be ironic for Muslims to insist on the evidence-based framework in a Western context, when that really is just a materialist, scientificist, or scientismist, I should say, as opposed to scientific, because we all know what that means. Sort of commitment to a certain way of looking at what works and what doesn't. So.
And I think it'd be important to acknowledge that it works both ways. So there is the issue that you're pointing out, is that some of these do require philosophical commitment, but so do these.
Yes.
So
nothing is neutral. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, certain therapeutic practices that are just mainstream and accepted, are based on a Cartesian duality, body mind. There is no spirit. There is no, so these are also problematic. It's not just I think we're very cautious of this, spirituality stuff, because it scares us a little bit, and that's fine. But this part is just the flip side of it, which is like a strictly. And I'm not pointing here. I'm pointing at the Western clinical modes is quite materialist, and so that's also problematic. So I think it's really important. What you were saying. It really comes down to finding the right person for you, for your constitution, what works for you, for your belief system, and someone who is able to bring that holistic approach, and not just be like, because I've had therapists that are, this is the way to heal, and if it doesn't work for you, then you need to change. And I'm like, well, that's not really, it's not really effective.
To healing.
Yeah.
Let me just read out a few more comments from our audience. Jazakumullah khair, everyone, for your contributions. Sister Zainab continues, working as a trauma counsellor, the popularization of the word trauma has been helpful in nudging individuals to turn inwards and challenge their history, ask themselves what really happened and why it happened, but does need to be regulated by professional guidance. Sister, she also goes on to say, also comes down to the fixed mindset and growth mindset, to have the level of self-awareness to look at the trauma as a path to self-development. And that's the point that you're talking about with the prophets, may Allah be pleased with them, and so forth. Then Sister Amruha mentions, can you please explain the concept of spiritual bypass and the risks of it? I'm not sure who to direct this question to. Would that be yourself, Sister Nasreen? Yeah.
I need the definition. That
I'm not familiar either. I'm not familiar. Sister Amruha, if you're watching, can you please?
Yeah, if you can just give a definition.
If you can define that for us, feel free to tag me so I get a tag. I'm keeping a close eye on my phone, so it'd be great if you can dive into that for us. Okay, so look, in the interest of time and just being conscious of how we're running, actually we've had a question. Let's ask Brother Mohammed. So a sister has asked, what are the Eastern therapies called that Brother Mohammed experienced that you sort of looked at and so forth?
It was a bit of a, like I said, so the first therapist who was extremely effective with me wasn't applying a particular therapy. What she was doing, she's very well trained in the Western therapeutic sciences, and then she had done her own. She's also a researcher, so she'd, for example, explored Islamic understandings of healing. So there's, for example, go back to Al-Balkhi, Al-Muhasabi, the sustenance for bodies and souls, which Al-Ghazali built on. Al-Ghazali's corpus is huge in terms of healing, and that self-development approach is a massive one. So there's a large tradition within the Islamic corpus that focuses on healing. So I can't really, unfortunately, I can't name the specific therapies because the therapists that I've been to have drawn on a number of them and essentially done a trial and error approach with me to say, okay, let's try this didn't work, let's try a different one. And in the end, what did work for me was sort of a blending of multiple different traditions. But what I would say is that every tradition has its spiritual healing practices. And notwithstanding the comments you made about, some of them verging on being problematic with the Islamic traditions, all of them are pointing towards the same thing, which is essentially, when we talk about holistic therapy, we're talking about wholeness and connection.
There's something more than the physical.
Correct, yeah. We're talking about reconnecting back to the divine. And whatever name is given to it, whatever, different philosophies, essentially they're moving in that direction. They have different, methodologies for doing it, but they're all trying to reconnect to that divine source, which again, in the Islamic tradition, broadly defined, is also doing the same thing. So in Al-Balkhi's text, for example, he looks at the disease of the heart and the spiritual diseases, which is the Ghazalian approach as well. The spiritual disease is, so the bodily symptoms that we've described are symptoms of a spiritual ailment, and not the other way around, which is why I made that comment earlier about the, the evidence-based, is that there's an ailment of the soul, there's an ailment of the heart, a disease of the heart, fi qulubihim marad, and that is what causes the rest. So it sort of flips it on its head in a certain way. And in many ways, according to my limited understanding of the other traditions, they tend to approach it in a similar way. If we heal the spiritual, and this is what drew me to Foucault, he's describing ancient Greek philosophy in an identical way. If you commit yourself to a care of the soul, all of the physical ailments will follow. Okay, so the path to healing is the spiritual healing path first, then the heart, then the mind, then the body follow in that order. I know there are some sciences that sort of go similar trends, but it's I guess a different order of things would probably be the best way to describe it.
Yeah, no, fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Let's segue to a question. The types of trauma and how they manifest, and this is at the level of just sort of mentioning the big buckets, Sister Nasreen, because I want our audience today to, as rich as this discussion is, I want some things to really just be crystal in people's head, and to walk away with some real basic knowledge that helps us start to sort of map different types of trauma and I guess understand this topic at a bit more of a deeper level. So can you tell us what the different types are? And we referred to them in the discussion before the episode.
Look, I think trauma works sort of on a continuum. Anyway, depending on the severity of it and what people experience. Usually there are three categories that they fall under. So you're looking at acute, which is someone who would have just experienced a single event. A single event could be an accident, a rape, or a one-off sexual abuse, or a murder or a shooting. They're single events, and that we would classify that as acute. Then we go down to another category, and that then we classify that as chronic. Chronic is repeated exposure to an emotional experience. That could be domestic violence, that could be prolonged sexual abuse, that has happened for a number of years, non-stop. And then underneath that, we look at complex trauma. Now, complex trauma can happen as a result of various events. It does not link to one thing. It has to be multiple things happening all at the same time over various period of years. And that's when we would classify post-traumatic stress disorder as complex trauma, because it's something that the person can't indicate that it's just one thing. It's a multiple or various thing that has happened to the person over a period of time.
So let's say the concept, like the idea of war and stuff, right? We were talking about it before. So where would that fit in that continuum? Like,
well, that's a really it's a good question, because war, it's multifaceted to begin with, because it could fall under complex if you were sort of there. It's various things would have happened during war: poverty, not having working, probably in some cases rape, murder, watching your family. So there's variations of that a person may have been exposed to. So we usually put that under complex trauma, and then or chronic trauma, depending on the experience. And then we'd probably look at intergenerational stuff, because then it trickles down from generation to generation. Me having come from Afghanistan, you've come from Lebanon, you're from Pakistan, India. Sorry, my bad. That's the same thing. We've all come from countries that have experienced something quite severe. Like my father was in the military for a very long time, so I still see remnants of that now in him. He still has nightmares, but I can see its effect, and in us and what we've been through, and the things that are unfolding in Afghanistan right now, because I was born in Afghanistan. So I was born and I left prior to the Soviet invasion. So I was in the midst of all of that. So that can definitely trickle down to generation and generations to come if we don't learn to create better coping mechanisms and break that chain.
Okay, I think that's really, really useful. So let's reflect on Brother Mohammed's situation. Where would that sort of be classified in the field or in a clinical setting? Like, would that be complex? Would that be, you said PTSD, Mohammed?
Complex. It's complex. Because it probably wouldn't have come down to just one.
No, definitely wouldn't.
One comment. It would have been a variation of things over a period of time that would have solidified something for you.
Yeah. And what's happened is, subhanAllah, with the therapy, each symptom we've been able to link back to a particular event or series of events. So it's very interesting in that way that it's not the overall experience of trauma has led to this thing. It's, for example, if there is a notion of, or a belief of self-hatred somewhere, for example, or an issue with voice or a body conscious image, each one of those symptoms we've been able to tie back to a particular experience or set of experiences. And once we've healed that experience, then the others still remain because they're tied to something different. So I find it's really fascinating in that way. It's not, I don't have the experiences with the other categories, but the complex one is very interesting in that sense.
And to end today's episode, and a very fitting note, inshallah, let's dive into the bit of an important bucket of discussion, which is where to get help and how, right? And what do these therapies, or what does therapy generally do with regards to these different types of traumas, right? So, Mohammed, I know we've discussed a little bit about it, but at the most basic level, what is the idea behind therapy when it comes to trying to heal and grow and develop from trauma? And that's a modality agnostic question. I'm not asking sort of which modality does what. It's more the idea, like what is the process? Like with a physical ailment, you try and get to the root cause, or pull out the bullet and then let the body do its own healing, and put antiseptic on it or whatever. What's the idea with something like trauma?
So my experience and my own, I guess, the way that I put it together with my own work, the essence of healing for me comes back to self-love. And the primary, and I'm talking about when you peel back everything, it comes back to a notion of love, and so it's no accident that the poets and the people who've gone through these massive transformations almost always end up at love. And from as wide as Nelson Mandela to Malcolm X to all these big figures, to the poets of our history, they come back to this core concept of love. And I found that, again, in my own experience and my research, once you peel back the different layers of emotions and hurts and injuries, it comes back to a question of love. And there's a lack of self-love when there is trauma, and the healing is a matter of reforming that love. And again, drawing back on my own experience and understanding of it, the primary barrier to that, again, if we peel back everything else, is fear. So it's a fear of that connecting back into love. So for me, there in my
Love of what? Love of the self, love of others?
I want to say love of self, but I don't want to get caught up in the language games, because I'm talking of nafs in the Arabic sense. Self, the way we understand it today, is quite individualistic ego. So nafs operates on a spectrum, has more than a dozen meanings, goes from ego all the way through to ruh, essentially. So the traumatized self operates out of ego, the state of unconsciousness, and in that sense, it's operating in a state of ghafla, that heedlessness, and it does that, in my opinion, because of the self-hatred, the lack of self-love. And so, as you proceed along the healing journey and you increase the love of self, nafs, you move towards the more ruhani, the more spiritual state of the self, which is the state of the fitra. That's the state of the. So, if you look at the three basic understandings of nafs through the Quran, nafsul amaratun bisu, nafsul subhanallah, what's the second one? Nafsul lawama, nafsul mutma'inna. Again, you could, I'm not sure if you'd agree with this, but you could broadly look at them as states of consciousness as well. So the amaratun bisu, the one that imposes the ill, is operating in a state of heedlessness or unconscious, and that's resulting from the lack of self-love. The middle one, the lawama, would be a state of consciousness, broadly speaking, and that's where the jihad, the nafs, happens. That's where the fight happens, and then the qalb, the heart, turns you to one direction or the other. The next one, and this is where my work really comes in, and would, I guess, take issue with some of the current therapies, is their ceiling is the consciousness. And the ideal in many of these approaches is to reach consciousness. Whereas the state of fitra is a state of transconscious, and the nafsul mutma'inna is a state of surrender, is a nafs of surrender. And so when we talk about love, I'm talking about reaching the state of surrender into that oneness, into that fitra, as self-love. So not self in terms of individual, but self in terms of journeying through the multiple selves to the ultimate self of surrender.
No, fascinating. And so, Sr Nasreen, from a therapeutic and sort of clinical perspective, or whatever the right phrase to use is, how does this play out then in a therapy sort of setting?
There's two things I usually tell people, is that you really need to be ready to explore this, because it is confrontational, and oftentimes there is that fear, am I ready to face everything that, because I can assure you, I've had so many clients who will come into therapy for at least 6 months, 12 months, and then they tell you, what the trauma is. So there has to be a point where they're actually ready to explore all of that, firstly. And secondly, it's about identifying if the therapist is actually trained in this particular area, and what kind of modalities that they use that will help you and is of benefit to you. They're the most two important things that a person really needs to explore, especially having a trained clinician who understands trauma within its entirety and has a really good grasp of all the modalities that exist, even from a holistic approach. You walk away actually in a much better position. And we have services out in the communities. There's so many psychologists that that work in this space, as well as and even I usually say, hey, at Line, for example, you can contact that, and just to get a brief understanding, and then you've got referral pathways that you can go, that they can identify referral pathways for you that will help you overcome overcome that.
In a very practical sense, I guess one question that emerges is, how long does this process take? People ask that question a lot, right? And I'm sure you probably get that a lot. The person wants to know, when will I be healed? When will I be whole again? And I guess in your experience, you're talking about 10 years of in and out and trying different things. So tell us a little bit about that, both of you. I'm very interested in this. What would you say, Mohamed?
I would say the healing journey is not measured by time, it's measured by will. Which draws back to what you said. There has to be a willingness to confront the darker parts of ourselves and our fears. So mine took 10 years because I was scared to confront initially, and once it came to fruition that this is what's actually happening, and I delved deep, it's, from my perspective, it's I'm going to say entirely a matter of will. I mean that there's a time element in terms of creating safety, creating the conditions, understanding the right modalities and so on. But in terms of the healing itself, I really don't believe it's measured by time. I believe it is measured by the will to confront it and overcome it. Because essentially, in many ways, although, and I don't want to at all downplay the severity of trauma, I mean, me of all people don't want to downplay it, but in many ways, it is a matter of letting go. And so in that sense, it is entirely within our control. And letting go isn't really a timed procedure, you know. When you're ready to let go, you can just let go.
Let go of what, just to be clear?
Whatever it is that you're holding on to that is causing the trauma. So the trauma is a matter of holding on to an experience.
Got it.
So for example, in certain modalities, you go back and revisit that experience in order to be able to let go of the trauma that you captured in that experience. So letting go isn't, I mean, literally, you know, mabsutatan, you know, it's the openness of the hands, being able to free yourself from that clenched fist. And so I really don't believe, at least in my experience, that it's a matter of time, but a matter of will.
Yeah.
And do you believe recovery is possible then?
Yeah, I don't believe it's possible. It is possible. Yeah. I've alhamdulillah recovered from a lot of my trauma, and I'm talking about the physical ailments in the body, the way that they showed up, from, you know, jaw tension to stomach knots to all of these things. I have recovered from them. So it's not a matter of belief. I've experienced them, and absolutely you can.
And what would you say?
And I agree. Like, you can't measure recovery by time. I mean, I know people that I've treated who've overcome it in like 6 months' time, and then there are people who have done therapy for about 4 or 5 years, and they're still stuck. And so we can't measure it in that sense, because it really comes down to the person and whether their willingness to change and their willingness to let go of those experiences. So I don't think I could. You can measure it. It really depends on the person.
And I guess, you know, in your sort of experience in the field, how have you seen therapy with determination of the individual involved change people? Like, what have you seen, like, from where people have started?
It's brilliant, because you can see when they come into your first session to the time that you finish, and you can see a transformation. You know, not just I've let go, but a self-transformation and their journey and the way they perceive things, the way they look at life, and the way they transform their relationships as well. So you can see a really good, you know, a journey manifest itself. It's brilliant. And it is those ones who are actually willing to change and willing to take that first step. And, you know, I like this, I'm going to sound controversial, but, you know, women are probably a lot quicker to come and approach therapy services and want to heal.
That's true.
Men do not.
Why? I want to end on that question, because it's really practical. Why do you think, Mohamed?
I mean, let's stick with the controversy. We have a particular notion of manhood, or notions of manhood, which I used to embody, which are that, you know, men don't cry, men don't, you know, we don't have these emotions like you weaker sex have. All of these beliefs, they hold us back from even considering the idea that this could be us, and this could be us needing to do these things. So again, going back to my own experience, I had it all under control, and I did, you know, physically, in terms of material life, I had it all under control, and I was doing really well. But I didn't even have a bare understanding of the emotional life cycle that's going on inside me, and the torment, until, like you said, my body just collapsed and said, "Khalas, like, you can't keep doing this." So I do believe a lot of it ties back to our notions, very unhealthy notions of manhood, what it means to be a man. And subhanAllah, we see this in discussions all the time online, which is really sad. I mean, it's easy to be critical of it, but at the end of the day, it's really sad for me, because I truly believe underpinning that is self-hatred. It really is, because you couldn't love yourself and be so opposed to mercy, be so opposed to healing, be so opposed to these things. So I used to be critical of it, but I guess
there's more going on.
There's a lot. There's a lot of compassion that needs to be had with these people who are against these ideas.
And I think our definition of masculinity needs to change.
So we had a fascinating episode on this just the other night, right? And we approached the concept of masculinity, toxic masculinity, these big buzzwords that get thrown around. Haja Maha Abdo and Sister Namat from Muslim Women Australia, who do a lot of work in this space, domestic violence, and how our notions of manhood are sort of playing into gender roles and marriage and breakdown and stuff like that. And they sort of said, the same thing, that there's a huge problem with how our people understand this issue, and it's causing all of this. And really, even if it's just, let's go back, look at our tradition and how the real concept of masculinity was, going back to the what we were discussing before, Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and his emotional nature in front of his companions, incredible, right? Incredible.
That was the strength.
Yeah.
We're treating our even young boys that crying is like a horrible thing to do. Yes, it's a weakness, it's a vulnerability, and you don't do that. I always have an issue with that, because I think we should always be conscious of, when we're trying to educate and raise young men, we should always be conscious of that, because we don't want to raise them to be to look at emotions as something that's a weakness, that's a sign of weakness. That's not what our tradition, our Islamic tradition teaches us. Rasulullah, peace be upon him, was an example for humanity, and it's a shame that 1400 years later we are not practicing any of that.
In many ways, we're reversing the message in a very important sense, because the blocking and repressing of emotion is hardening the heart. And the whole point of Islam is to soften the heart, make it vulnerable.
Yes.
And we today see vulnerability as a weakness and as almost an insult. You're being vulnerable. But vulnerability is how you receive the guidance. It's the opening of the heart. And the opposite of that is harsh-heartedness, hard-heartedness, which is mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith as a negative attribute. So subhanAllah, in many ways, and that's why I think it's very sad that we've reached this point, because it's coming from very sincere people who are trying. But again, like me back, before I went through the healing, there's just a complete unawareness of that entire emotional life that is, wreaking havoc on us.
Yeah. Let me just see if we can just mention a few comments in passing. Just some good comments. SubhanAllah, great points. Never viewed it in this way. Jazakallah khair for the knowledge. Sister Sarah mentions, you can see it's also an ongoing journey of healing, because when we do it, we know we are fully healed, as in when we get to the end of that journey. Another Sister Nancy mentions vulnerability is strength. Allowing people to know what gets to you is a very courageous act, as in what your vulnerabilities are. And I think those are some of the so spiritual bypass. Here we go. Or spiritual bypassing is a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. The term was introduced in the mid-80s by John Wellwood, a Buddhist teacher and psychotherapist. Clinicians in pastoral psychology have identified both beneficial and detrimental manifestations of behavior that could be described as spiritual bypass.
Yeah, I think that draws on what we just discussed in terms of people who are using the tradition to literally bypass the emotional aspect, which is very... And one thing that I might just make a final point, which for me is critical, particularly for our deen. When we talk about trauma, and going back to that whole understanding of the nafs, and the different states that it takes us, when we're operating from a state of ghafla, from a traumatized state that lacks the self-awareness, it's impossible to be sincere in that state, because we're being driven by impulse, we're being driven by unconscious drives. And usually when we talk about, and again, this goes back to our contemporary understanding, when we talk about desires, we usually put a particular edge on it as lust, as, chasing shahawat and the dunya. And okay, in one way, sure, but in a more profound and deeper way, there are absolutely inherent desires in humans. The desire to be loved, to be heard, to be seen, all of these things are desires in a deeper sense. If they're not met, we will continue to chase those desires as adults, and that manifests in addictions, in all these different things. And so I think even our understanding of desire as a bad thing really needs to be challenged, because, and this, one of the big lessons that I learned from this journey is about judgment. I've had addictions, I had addictions all my life. By 17 I was addicted to gambling. I was absolutely, like 10 a.m. I'm at the casino, and I judged myself very harshly for it, and I was judged very harshly for it. And then more than 10 years later, through the healing process, I was able to tie it back to a very particular experience from when I was a very young child, and that just kept manifesting because there was a desire there to be seen and to be loved that was never fulfilled. And so I went back to a familiar space where I experienced that love one time, and I went and saw it in the casino. And so though, again, I think in many ways this is replicating our understandings of previous discussions, Islamophobia, racism, all these things where we're using really superficial understandings and meanings for concept. Desire is not simply, I want to do this or that thing. There are deep levels of desire that are driving us unconsciously. And it's impossible to be sincere if a big part of us is our body just doing what it needs. So again, in my experience, at one point, there was a deep desire for nurturing that just hadn't been fulfilled. And at one point, I simply collapsed into the lap of a woman, a strange woman I didn't know. I collapsed, and I just needed that feminine energy. I needed it. And my body said, you know what? Here it is. You just, and I was collapsed, like I almost fainted. But it was the body, again, dictating, saying, if you're not going to provide this, I'm just going to take it. So again, there's so much there that our community really needs to, I think, start educating and catching up on in terms of less judgment, less harshness, and just more accommodating, compassion, understanding. And I'm going to get slammed for this, but I mean, that's what it is, really.
No, I think they're very profound points. And I guess everyone will go through their own journey. But I think the key fundamental point is get help, right? It's important. Get the right help, find the right person, and get professional help as well from sort of qualified people. So, look, what a great discussion. Absolutely fascinating. I want to say Jazakallah khair, Mohamed, for opening up and shedding that light. Cannot possibly be easy, but honestly, I think it'll resonate with so many people, and I can see that in the comments, subhanAllah. So, absolutely fascinating stuff. And Sr Nasreen, for your insights and sort of helping us map the course a little bit. Really thank you, and Jazakumullah khair to both of you for shedding light on what is a difficult topic. And as a community, we still have a long way to go in recognizing that it's important to seek help for this and come to terms with our own individual traumas, and we all probably have them. So I need to get my skates on as well. But very important to being our whole selves, I suppose. So thank you so much both, and Jazakumullah khair everyone for joining us. It's been as usual on these episodes a very revealing, insightful, open discussion, and thank you for your comments. They really make these episodes what they are. And I guess we've come to the end of this particular Ramadan series of episodes. It's been again a great series of discussions on so many different varied topics, from marriage to cryptocurrency and finances to trauma and issues that aren't discussed openly the way that they should be. But alhamdulillah, I think we've again charted some new territory and really created a space for conversations which inshallah will lead to even more beneficial discussions. Just want to remind everyone, tomorrow's the last odd night again. Check out NZF's website, nzf.org.au, to see if that's an option for your zakah and for your extra sadaqah on that great night. And before I finish, once again, thank you both, brother and sister, for coming on, and all the best in the last few nights of Ramadan for what remains as well. To you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for joining us, and we will chat to you sometime next month when we go back to our normal monthly episode cadence, and definitely in Dhul Hijjah, where we will be back with another series, as we always are. These great months and times of the Islamic calendar are ones where we double down on these discussions in the hope to get us moving towards a holistic experience of our Islam as something that should dictate our personal selves, our self-development, and important conversations in the community that need to happen at times when the community is more Islamically attuned overall. And that's the purpose that this show serves. We hope you've enjoyed it again this year. We ask you to keep us in your dua, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك ونشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.